The year is 2020, you have all the time in the world and you are hopelessly spending much of it on TikTok. Eventually, you come across the following video. Then another, and another and another, and after a few weeks, your TikTok feed is full of gothic architecture and cardigan-wearing Oscar Wilde fanboys. You begin to romanticize life at boarding schools you didn't go to and the elite universities that you couldn't get into. You start dressing up for no reason, start listening to classical music. For some reason, you really want to learn how to speak Latin. How did you get here? Dark academia is an aesthetic popularized on TikTok and Instagram that idealizes life at elite North Atlantic boarding schools and universities. It idealizes Gothic architecture found in the Ivy League as well as Oxbridge in the United Kingdom. Consists of dimly lit Victorian libraries, music and art from the Romantic period, and dreary autumn weather typical of both the United Kingdom and New England. Dark academia also takes inspiration from the fashion of affluent Anglo-Saxons in the 30s and 40s. Think cardigans, blazers, dress shirts, tweed, and dull colors. But the aesthetic also incorporates a whole lifestyle. Think long, late-night study sessions in a Victoria library, museum visits, and reading the classics. The aesthetic itself is deeply emotional, using the sharp contrast between depression and betrayal with the thrill that comes from intellectual engagement. But why is this aesthetic so popular? To answer this question, we must go back to the roots of the movement. So the term dark academia first circulated on the website Tumblr back in 2015, and the demographic of Tumblr, let's just say, is generally considered to be more booky and chronically online than that of other sites. The site's also pretty niche, and while users of the site often circulated dark academia content, it wasn't really until the COVID-19 pandemic that dark academia made its debut into the mainstream. But before the term dark academia was even coined, many, we will argue, appealed to the aesthetic. In fact, we can argue that dark academia merely put a name to an idea that was already present in much of Western media. So let's take, for instance, the example of Harry Potter. The franchise centers its life on a Gothic-style boarding school where people wear old-fashioned robes and get into next-level hijinks. There is an elitism and, of course, magic, a hidden world where things like the outside economy and politics don't really seem to matter. And we see similar themes present in the books such as The Secret History, which is a novel about a murder that takes place among classic students at a New England boarding school. Films like Dead Poets Society, Kill Your Darlings, Beautiful Mind all seem to incorporate this aesthetic as well. The romanticization of the pairing of elite Anglo-Saxon academia with melancholy seems to go back at least a couple of decades. But what makes these books and movies so appealing to us, and what does that say about our society? So what is it that makes dark academia so attractive? I mean, at the core, the aesthetic is kind of depressing. What made it blow up on TikTok? Well, like many other things that blew up during the COVID-19 pandemic, it has something to do with the pandemic. Think about it. During COVID, high school and college students, who made up the base of TikTok users, were suddenly forced to do school from home. So they lost a lot of access to a lot of things typical in the traditional educational experience, such as study spaces and libraries. And education that was usually associated with an entire campus became reduced to just the bedroom, or in my case, the kitchen table. And the lackluster reality of the COVID era education pushed students to escapism and fantasy. These fantasies were made real in dark academia, an aesthetic that romanticizes the architecture and spaces associated with higher education. So students longing for a traditional educational experience found escapism in the dark academia aesthetic. The aesthetic also offered an escape from nihilism. Its general melancholic nature helped romanticize the feelings of despair and dread associated with the pandemic. To pandemic-stricken adolescents, dark academia helped them contextualize the seemingly impending doom that surrounded them. It took dark and serious feelings of existential dread and made them beautiful and acceptable. Dark academia's romanticization of melancholy became a coping mechanism for many who felt disillusioned by the lived educational experiences in COVID. But dark academia responds to much more than the COVID-19 pandemic. It responds to deep structural shifts in higher education, specifically American higher education. While universities today heavily promote the profit-driven careers of STEM, an example being my own university creating a data science school, dark academia universities seem to focus on literature, Latin, and other subjects that are deemed not useful. While universities today spend billions of dollars endlessly updating and expanding their campuses in what some have called the edifice complex, dark academia universities seem to stick to a more simple Gothic architecture that Anglo-Saxon universities and institutions have used for centuries. And also, the students in dark academia universities seem to live quite differently as well. They spend much of their time studying in the libraries, so they're not on their MacBooks that they got for a discount at the university bookstore to take their notes. They read literature and take notes with pen and paper instead. They don't go to football games. The only Greek life they really know about is the one that Plato said we should all live. And they don't use their university's gym or rock wall or hot tub. No foam slides either. Instead, dark academia students stick to the bare bones of academic life in the classes and studies. Putting this into a larger perspective, dark academia seems to respond to and reject the increasingly popular corporatized beer and circus approach to American higher education. Dark academia brings the educational experience back to the basics of reading, writing, and arithmetic. Dark academia seems to idolize education for education's sake. It is, in essence, devoid of capitalism. But this appeal of the dark academia aesthetic does not stop there. Keep in mind that during the COVID-19 pandemic, many different aesthetics came about. Think of cottagecore, visco girl, coastal grandma, and of course, normcore. What distinguishes dark academia from these aesthetics, though, has to be accessibility. So what do I mean by this? According to a 2020 New York Times article on the subject, though it can sound niche, part of dark academia's appeal is the fact that it is both more approachable aesthetically than other popular internet subcultures. One example being cottagecore. To be part of dark academia, you don't have to have access to a country house, a field of flowers, a big kitchen for baking, or an expensive prairie dress. Most of the clothing dark academia fans wear is vintage, can be easily found in secondhand stores or sites. Put differently, in the words of Vox writer Rebecca Jennings, the argument is that not all of us can access the actual trappings that cottagecore requires. A house in the country, excess time to devote to twee crafts, calm and quiet home life, but the simple act of putting on a blazer and reading Dostoevsky is far more doable. Dark academia's accessibility makes it popular. Anyone could participate in the fantasy. Simply typing dark academia into YouTube will give you access to hundreds of dark academia playlists that you can study to. These playlists mostly include classical music from the Romantic period, adding to dark academia's aestheticization of class. Speaking of class, a lot of dark academia lies in that. Mind you that North Atlantic boarding schools and elite universities up until fairly recently were extremely exclusatory. Even today, the majority of their students come from the old money establishment. To live dark academia is to have access to the resources, privileges, and mindset reserved for an elite upper class that has had money for too long to care about it. That's why dark academia seems to focus more on the humanities. It realizes an education that doesn't need to be monetized and a social class rich enough to not care about which profession makes the most money. The idea is that if you were old money, you could study whatever you wanted. This idea permeates in the film Dead Poets Society, which is often categorized as dark academia.
We don't read and write poetry because it's cute. We read and write poetry because we are members of the human race, and the human race is filled with passion. Medicine, law, business, engineering, these are noble pursuits and necessary to sustain life. But poetry, beauty, romance, love, these are what we stay alive for.
While this mentality goes over well with many of the boys, it becomes, spoiler alert, fatal for a certain boy who does not have as much money as his classmates. And because of his lack of wealth in comparison to his peers, his father pushes him to pursue a useful profession over his passion for acting in the arts. Overall, it's the idealization of old money and the freedom that it brings that in part makes dark academia so aesthetic. This last point strikes a personal chord with me because I've been subdued by this idolization of old money. In February 2020, yes, just one short month before the pandemic shut down much of the world, I attended an international physics competition at Phillips Exeter Academy in New Hampshire. For those of you who don't know, Exeter is one of the most elite boarding schools in the world, with alumni among the likes of Mark Zuckerberg and Andrew Yang. The place screams old money. We were the only public school to even compete in the competition. While there, I really came to appreciate how the beautiful Gothic architecture sort of clashed with the dreary New England landscape. I remember especially being taken aback by the library, which seemed to me like a dream study space. Overall, the weekend trip had me on the old money aesthetic like never before. The resources, beauty, and class that it brought deeply appealed to me. Months later, when I began seeing dark academia TikToks on my feed, I realized that I was not the only one to feel this way. At this point, we understand pretty well the appeal and popularity of dark academia, but its meteoric rise has not come without criticism. Dark academia often seems to neglect minorities. It is, after all, an aesthetic based on a time period and culture that was and still is extremely homogenous. In the words of Dr. Sarah Burton, a fellow from the City University of London Sociology Department, dark academia seems to leave out most women, working class, people of color, fatness, people with low economic or cultural capital, disability, carrying in domestic activities and labor, especially the enjoyment of these, motherhood, queerness, and the mundanity of academic life. I'd say if you look at the aesthetic at its base, she's right. Dark academia represents a very specific strand of society that historically has not been very diverse. Luckily, many efforts have been made to make the aesthetic overall more inclusive. While the fashion of dark academia may come from a very specific homogeneous culture, it can be worn by anyone. While so-called dark academia authors such as Oscar Wilde or Emily Dickinson seem to be overwhelmingly white, fans have incorporated black thinkers such as Langston Hughes and Toni Morrison into the aesthetic. The point of all this is that while dark academia comes from a very homogeneous place, fans of the aesthetic can do and have done a lot to adapt the aesthetic to the multicultural world in which we live. An aesthetic can start from anywhere and grow to fit the tastes and values of those who appreciate it. And a second common criticism of dark academia comes from its idolization of unhealthy lifestyles. Dark academia seems complacent with its melancholy, and as mentioned earlier, this can be a good thing, making the aesthetic more honest. But dark academia also can cross into the romanticization of depression, something that TikTok edits often fall victim to. More importantly, it also often borders on promoting unhealthy lifestyles. The dark academia life is very sedentary and apathetic in general to sleep. The pursuit of knowledge in an aesthetic space overcomes everything else. Of course, just because a TikTok edit doesn't include someone going to therapy or exercising outside doesn't mean that the aesthetic discourages those things. But what it does mean is that proponents of dark academia must be careful in the message that they are portraying. Does dark academia give room for healthy lifestyles, or is its neglect of certain aspects of a healthy lifestyle intentional? I honestly don't know. What I do know is that dark academia looks cool as